Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over a tier list ready for Toronto. You can probably hear in my voice that I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to try and be a little bit briefer than I otherwise would be, but I still want to talk about the sort of metagame changes, talk about a few matchups that have been popping up from Surging Sparks, and I also want to talk about the meta percentage prediction as well for sort of how popular these archetypes are going to be, and we're going to do that as we go along. Let me get organized here. We are looking, well, I'm going to be going through the decks in terms of the order in which I'm doing it is going to be based on the limitless points in the 3 tournaments we've had so far, the US, in Europe, and in Perth most recently. So we'll start with Regidrago VSTAR, which has been the most point-earning deck so far, and I'm going to put this still into the S tier. I still think this is a safe play for the tournament. I think a lot of the time we have seen recently the Alone Executor EX. I personally think that's a bit of a bait, to be honest with you, and that's because I also think the Klawf Terapagos deck has a better time against the Drago when it doesn't play the Temple of Sinnoh and the Jamming Tower. I think it's very logical to put those back into Drago coming into this next set of tournaments, because I'm expecting a lot of Klawf Terapagos, and Drago can at least go Stadium Bounce Iono, take knockouts, or go for like a Dragapult play and not take prizes for return and make life difficult for the Klawf player. And then set up like multi-prize turns, be it with Kyurem or be it with like a follow-up Prime Catcher plus Dragapult play. Those sorts of things I think are going to be more effective for this deck. And of course, if you have Jamming Tower, you can try and deny the Mochi from a one-hit kill onto your Drago, so that's quite relevant. I think Goodra is very, very good in Drago right now. And ultimately, I don't love the egg. I think it's been experimented with. It's like kind of cute. But I think especially with Terapagos Dusknoir dropping in play in favour of Klawf Terapagos, I think it makes more sense to have the 2 Stadium cards in the deck right now for Drago. I think with that in your back pocket, you're still one of the best decks out there. Some of the best matchups for Regidrago include Charizard, Gardevoir, the Dragapult Thorns, which has been picking up in popularity recently. Obviously, Lost Zone Box is pretty good, and it's also showing favoured into Terapagos Dusknoir. I think that's in part because of the Alolan Egg, though, so I would expect that to be a bit closer if you're not playing those decks. And your hardest matchups continue to be some of the aggressive archetypes. The Raging Bolt, you're about 40% into Klawf Terapagos, which is the sort of new deck on the block. But like I said, I'm hoping those stadiums bring it a little bit closer. And it's also showing as quite negative into Snorlax, although I don't think it's that bad. And again, reincorporate those stadium cards. Getting on to our next best performer then, we have Charizard Pidgeot. It did obviously win over in Europe and actually was an all Charizard final. I'm going to put this in just an A tier play. My fear is still that it's fairly weak into Regidrago VSTAR, although it's showing out as 45%, so maybe it's not all that bad. You're also not that strong into the new Terapagos Klawf. Obviously they have grass type coverage, whether they're playing super effective glasses or whether they're playing Cobalion, which I think is probably better if you're expecting a lot of Charizard. That's somewhat of a troubling matchup. You're still like kind of close into Lugia, kind of close into Dragathorns as well, which is a new one which is popping up. You do get to mop up the new wave of Miraidon alongside the Raging Bolts, although possibly we've already hit that peak of Miraidon as well, and I'm expecting it to probably come down in play once again. So there are still some matchups that you want to dodge and weave. I think part of the reason it was a Charizard final was actually we had a couple Gholdengo in our top cut, which is quite a rare sight, to be honest with you. So I'm going to sit this in at about 10% in terms of meta play rates, and I think it's only an A tier play. If you're very comfortable with Charizard, go for it. I think we still have to give it the caveat that Drago is probably the best deck in the game, and you're still a little bit weak into that matchup. In at the third best performer, which is really, really astonishing because this is a new archetype on the block, we have the Klawf Terapagos deck. I have to put this as an S tier play. I mean, it's not been that played, obviously, in the first tournament, then it picked up in popularity, but even then, it was like very low in overall numbers and has converted very well in both Europe and in Perth most recently as well, getting top placements in their top 4, top 8 placements, which is really, really exceptional. And also the online data is pretty disgusting for this archetype, to be honest. It's showing as one matchup, which is 45%, which is into Roaring Moon, and then a 49% into Lugia, which spells really, really good news for this deck. It even boasts some 60% into Charizard, Raging Bolt, Drago is almost 60%, 70% into Snorlax, of course, which is a nice thing you can naturally collateral, and also decent into the other Terapagos build as well. So I think Klawf Pagos is a real deck. I'm hoping players have had enough time to learn the list and whatnot. It's got some early game sequencing, and it doesn't have the most robust draw engine, but it's definitely a real deck. And I think people, since Sacramento, have had enough time to get this deck to work, so I think around 9% 90% of people is what I'm predicting to bring this archetype. If you've seen it online recently, you'll have known that it's definitely a powerful deck, and it's very consistent at what it tries to do, which I think is really, really important for the deck. It's got going first place, it's got going second place, which also ticks another box for me, where a number of these other archetypes in the game really want to be going first or second. This deck can play both sides of that coin, which is also a really nice bonus for the list. In at the 4th best performing deck so far, we have Raging Bolts. This is going to be dipping in popularity, I think, definitely, but I still think it just about hangs on to that A tier, because it still does boast a number of decent matchups. The data that I'm looking at from the online spaces shows that it's okay into Gardevoir. I would imagine you have to play Lost Vacuum to make that work. It's got a decent time into Lugia, as we know, decent into Miraidon as well, even the new builds that do play Area Zero. It's decent into the Regidrago matchup, and it's also good into the old build of Terapagos, with some of its worst matchups still being the Snorlax, the Pidgeot control, not great into the Lost Zone box either, and seems to be coming up a little bit short into the new Gholdengo wave, as well as the Klawf Terapagos, which is the main concern really for me in terms of picking this archetype. I think it's a harder choice, but I think there's still going to be a core number of players still looking to play the archetype, and it's been so popular in the past that I think 9% in terms of play rate is still where I'm expecting this Raging Bolt to end up. Definitely still think it's going to make the day one graphic in terms of popularity. Next up, the Snorlax. I think this can only be a B tier play because there's the new Klawf Terapagos, which is showing as a really, really bad matchup, around 20% from the online scenes. And I also think Lugia might be having a small resurgence. I think we've had its dip. We've seen Miraidon come out, and there's been that sort of week of panic of not playing the deck. And I think now that we've started to see that Lost Zone box is probably sub 10%, we've seen that Miraidon's probably sub 10%, I think there's a number of pilots who can bring Lugia back to the table. Notably, Rahul played it in Perth, so that's an indication that you might have more of a clear runway for Lugia to be a deck in the format once again, and that's something Snorlax definitely doesn't want to see. And it's also quite weak into Roaring Moon, which is kind of still getting those spikes here and there in tournaments. So I think Snorlax, as we know, never that popular of a choice. I'm just going to give it the 3% here in terms of overall meta placement. I also think it's just hard to justify with Klawf being the new deck on the block that naturally collaterals Snorlax. Maybe some Pidgeot control players can find a new solution to Terapagos Klawf. I know we saw Sando making some tweets about it, how you can like checkmate that combination of cards, but I don't think a Snorlax can really incorporate that package too easily. So I think Snorlax can only really chill out in the B tier. Yes, it can still have some crazy 70% matchups. Yes, there'll be some pilots that completely scoop to you as soon as you flip over your opening basics, be it Mimikyu plus Mist or be it Snorlax itself. So it still has those boasts, but I think it's a hard sell with the new fear of Klawf Terapagos, which could be, you know, upwards of that 9% in terms of play rate, which is what I'm expecting. Next up we have Gholdengo. I'm also going to shove this into the B tier. It's a weird deck, actually, where it has a number of 50-50 matchups from the online data. It's only really, like, bad matchups are Lost Zone box, as well as some of the controlling matchups, which I can see. But equally, it doesn't have a bunch of, like, high 55 or 60%. It's really just around that 45 to 55% into the majority of other matchups. It only looks like it's very good into, like, Roaring Moon and into Raging Bolt, because you can really dictate that prize map very, very easily against them. But for the most part, it's how you play with the Gholdengo that's going to sort of make you go far, be it that sequencing of how you're using your ciphers appropriately and whatnot. But also, you don't have that many good early game ball search outs, so sometimes you'll just force first and you don't have access to those poffins and you give up more than one prize as you're getting into the game, or you're working towards Togekiss and sometimes those coin flips don't go your way, and you really do need to have some sort of prize cheat mechanic in Gholdengo to make it a successful deck, whether it is the Palkia package with enough water energy, even if you are playing Energy Search Pro, like we saw from Owen Kammerman, or if it's going to be a Togekiss coin flip list with Night Stretcher and an elevated count of Pokestop. That's really the main debate with Gholdengo. I personally still like the Palkia the most, because I like having Cologne in the deck anyway. It's just a versatile card in the deck. But I think there'll be a number of players who pick this just because it's actually similar to Drago and it's a 50-50 deck, which is quite interesting, and it has a really, really good draw engine behind it. I initially put this quite low in my overall meta prediction in terms of play rates, but I might bump it up. It's had enough top 8 placements now that I think it can sort of see itself as an established archetype, so I'm going to go up to 4% for this one. I initially had like 2%, but I think that's pretty low when I think there's enough attributes to this archetype that players will want to bring the deck, and the eSearch Pro does give it this new dimension in terms of burst damage that was really lacking in the deck, where someone can just take that first prize into you and you have really good confidence that you're just smashing anything in response that following turn, and that obviously helps filter out the deck as well, makes your Pokestop stronger, gives you more reliability of just going bonus into bonus into bonus into Fairs and all that stuff, and then your chain never really gets disrupted. So it does feel like a B tier all-rounder similar to Drago that might be a little bit less targeted as well. So maybe I'm being a bit harsh on this one, but because it's so 50-50-ish, I don't know why you're not just playing Drago instead. Next up is Lost Zone Box. I also have to hang this out in B tier. I think there's still that looming fear of Regidrago being a pretty poor matchup, although it is closer now that you do have that Pikachu. It's still showing as a sub 40% from the online data, which looks pretty poor to me. It's still fairly weak into the controlling matchups, which is a worry, and it's still looking like it's worried about Miraidon because of the ease of just spamming Iron Hands and using Bundle effectively, and also it seems like it's not great into the Dragathorns matchup, which is a slightly surprising one for me, but I guess Dragapult spam is just too much to deal with, and they have easy routes around Pikachu. The main boast of Lost Box being the Lugia matchup, which who knows how popular that's going to be. I'm expecting a small uptick, but I still don't think it's going to be absolutely massively popular. I also think Raging Bolt is sort of dipping in play from its like top 3 status in popularity, but you do at least pick up Gholdengo, which seems to be a decent matchup. So an interesting spread. I feel like you're having to dodge more matchups than you're looking to hit realistically in terms of the percentages that I'm predicting. So I think Lost Zone Box is just going to chill around that sort of 3% threshold. Still a tough choice, but definitely a strong engine at the backbone, and Pikachu is a ridiculous card right now, so I can't hate on anyone picking Lost Box, but it's hard to justify. Then there's Gardevoir. This has been really interesting to look at its resurgence in terms of seeing Kato's list, which is an older 60, as well as the Call Bell plus Trolley list of Gardevoir. Admittedly, I haven't played enough of that archetype, but the matchup data online, at least, doesn't look that favourable for Gardevoir. Has lots of, like, mid 40% matchups, and then only has a couple of matchups that are that positive, looking at like Pidgeot control, which who cares if you're favored into that because you're never really going to hit more than one, and then Lugia, which also it's like not the best because you don't really know how popular that deck's going to be either right now. Definitely a sub 10% I would think of Lugia, with the new fear of Miraidon and Lost Zone Box. And even Klawf Terapagos to an extent as well. So I think Gardevoir can only really be a B tier deck, even though it's a really consistent list in the room. It's one of the few decks that does like to go second if you're playing the Trolley 60, but I would also be concerned that Klawf Terapagos is definitely going to play Genesect now for Mirror, so you can get collateraled if you are playing the Trolley 60, which is a concern, but there are going to be Gardevoir heads. You're still a really good single prize deck, one of the most singlest prizey decks in the game actually right now, which is surprising, but that's really how Gardy plays. And that still does give it a few boast matchups, and I think you can still pilot this well. Its online data is pretty disappointing, actually, for how good the archetype really is, but it's a bit up in the air how you want to play it, and I still think there is the looming concern of Drago being awkward, and Klawf, if they go first into you now and does develop the Genesect, I think that's really rough if you're trying to trolley. Maybe Kato's list is just still the most balanced way to go overall. Next up is Terapagos Dusknoir. I'm going to have to put this into C tier. I think Klawf Terapagos is just such a new, awkward matchup that it's really hard to pick this deck. It's like a 30% matchup. Oh, it's worse. It's 21% matchup into the other build of Terapagos, which is really, really terrifying. There's also Charizard that's recently just won, and that's still awkward for Terapagos Dusknoir. Raging Bolt's still awkward for you. Regidrago's still awkward. Again, it depends on where their stadiums go and if they're playing a Alolan Egg or not, but that's still one that you don't love to play unless you play those boofers, and even the Roaring Moon is showing as like a fairly awkward matchup. The online data, again, not that appealing for this deck, to be honest with you. It does boast a decent time into Lugia, Miraidon, and Gardy, as well as Dragathorns it's okay into, because your engine's not that disrupted, but looking at the sort of top 4 decks, they don't look that great. So I feel like it's a much worse metagame for Terapagos Dusknoir, and I think people will overall be moving off this deck, so I'm just expecting around 3% for this one. Roaring Moon actually has really good underlying data from the online scene. Online, it feels like its only bad matchups are Charizard, which is slight negative, as well as Gholdengo, which is a bit of a surprise. And it does boast a number of 60%ers in here. It looks like it's having a really decent time into Miraidon, the controlling matchups, which is still one of the best boasts because you naturally play Petrarunt, and it's okay into Terapagos Dusknoir. The issue is that those big 70%ers are matchups that are not all going to be that popular. You know, Snorlax, Pidgeot, Terapagos, I'm putting these as like 3 and 2% matchups, really. And it's the more high-profile matchups which are more concerning, which are more close matchups. So I feel like this isn't the best turbo deck you can be playing. Spoilers, there's already Raging Bolt, but also Miraidon to come. So I think this is actually going to be one of the worst picks of the bunch, but it does still have opportunity to spike. It still plays Judge, which is still one of its biggest boasts, from my opinion. So if you do like having that disruptive element of your deck, you can still go for the Moon. Every deck I'm talking about today are justifiable picks to a certain degree. I'm just thinking of purely for a play for this weekend. Anything that I don't talk about today are decks that I would say is giving you a disadvantage in the tournament, but all of these are worth playing to some degree if you're confident with them. I just think Roaring Moon isn't the easiest turbo deck to pilot this weekend. Lugia has that hiatus, but I am fairly confident in putting it back towards that A tier. Its worst matchups from the online data is Lost Zone Box, which makes sense because of Pikachu, Miraidon, which is obvious, and Raging Bolt continues to be an awkward matchup. But I think you can just about finesse that with how decent it is into the other decks, that Lugia is still just like a high power level archetype that's still trying to impose itself. I feel like no fence sitters are going to sort of gravitate towards Lugia, but I think people who are tried and trusted with it and respect the deck will continue to bring it, so I think around 7% is where I'm expecting Lugia to end up. Miraidon's in a bit of a strange situation because Lugia's dropping in popularity, Charizard probably going up in play, which isn't ideal for you. There's also some threat of Gholdengo getting a bit more representation, which means it's not the easiest play for Miraidon. I think probably Raging Bolt's the best aggressive archetype you can be playing for this weekend, but I think there'll just be a handful of people still rocking that Miraidon. We know inherently it's very good at imposing its own strategy. It's very consistent right now, so I'm just about going to cling on to the A tier for Miraidon in that it's imposing itself. It gets to play 3 games really consistently, and it will be probably the most consistent deck out of all the decks in the game right now in terms of what it's trying to achieve and how many good ball search cards and ability-based Pokemon get you into the game. So I think that's the main thing propping it up. Yes, you're concerned into like the controlling matchups as well, but that's still a low enough percentage that I think is acceptable for at least getting into day 2 of the competition, but then things get a little bit tougher when there's going to be more Charizards around. And as we know, Control always has good conversion from day 1 to day 2 as well, so not the easiest to win the tournament with Miraidon, but still a decent deck to try and make day 2 of that competition. I'm going to put Pidgeot Control into C tier. It really doesn't matter where I put this archetype because the people who love the deck will still play it no matter what, and they'll always insist that it's going to be way higher, but its online data is still swingy, to be honest with you. It does have some great like 70 and 80% in here, which is hilarious to look at, where it's really good into Bolt, Miraidon, Lost Zone Box, Gholdengo, Snorlax obviously, but it's a little bit tricky into Turbo Moon, it's tricky into Lugia still, it's tricky into Gardevoir, even Dragathorns is popping up, which isn't ideal for you, so I think there's only going to be a handful of people risking it all with Pidgeot, but as we know, the players that do choose to play the deck are highly skilled pilots just by the nature of it, because you're not going to go far if you're not good for the list, so I think I have to put it in C tier, but it's basically irrelevant where I put this deck because my opinion won't change the opinion of people who actually like this archetype, so we'll move on from there. And then we end on Dragapult Iron Thorns. This is a more 50-50-ish deck than I first thought. I'm going to pop this into the A tier. It looks like it has game plans into the majority of matchups, which is really interesting, actually. It comes out as slightly negative against the Regidrago and the Miraidon players, but for the rest of the matchups, you're going above 55%, which is looking really, really good, to be honest with you. I know Mads has done a video. He's also been on the Lake of Rage podcast, so you can hear all about the archetype. It's been profiled by pretty much everyone at this point, and it's an easy enough deck to just pick up and play that I think there'll be a handful of people actually taking a risk with the archetype. It's such an easy one to pilot. Your turn 1-2 doesn't change like in any situation, and it's pretty intuitive as to what you're trying to do in terms of how the damage counters lines up and how to even your Radiant Alakazam just to fix the numbers, certainly into the V-Star matchups. And just know that you have the ability disruption, but also the fact that you can deny Pheasantipity for the majority of the game from the opponent, even when you are attacking. By virtue of Dragapult's attack, you are denying engines throughout the majority of the game into a ton of matchups. So yeah, really cool deck, and I think it is going to be an A-tier play this weekend. So that's a total of 80% for the sort of top decks in the game. I think there will be a handful of other archetypes, as always, going into the tournaments. I feel like Regidrago is still the best deck in the game, but Klawf Terapagos honestly could prove itself to be one of the best decks. I'm interested to see how it copes with Drago possibly going back towards those stadium cards, which I do think is going to be a big swing in the matchup. I'm also interested to see if there is going to be another wave of Lugia coming back up, or if I'm just expecting too much of this archetype and it has passed its heyday. Thanks so much for watching to the end. Thanks for listening, even though I have a pretty sore throat right now. And I'll see you in the next video tomorrow. Cheers.